Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Ishita, and I'm honored to welcome you all to AI Revolution, an ethics quest across disciplines, with today's focus on AI and governance. As AI continues to transform industries and societies around us, one of the most pressing challenges we face is ensuring effective AI governance, which refers to policies, frameworks, and practices that guide the responsible development, deployment, and management of artificial intelligence systems. This is particularly critical in the public sector where AI is applied to healthcare, national security, and other essential services. So today's panel, we will be exploring the evolving landscape of AI governance and how governments can foster innovation while also maintaining oversight and regulation to ensure AI is used ethically, transparently, and in alignment with public interests. So we're privileged to have two distinguished panelists today who bring a wealth of knowledge and experiences in these areas. So our first panelist, Dr. Lara Kirfel, a cognitive and behavioral scientist and currently a postdoc scholar, research scholar at the Center of Humans and Machines at the Max Planck Institute of Human Development in Berlin. Dr. Kirfel completed her PhD at University College London and has also worked as a postdoc research scholar at Stanford University. Her research delves into moral psychology, AI ethics, focusing on how AI systems make decisions, and more importantly, how we can navigate the ethical challenges that arise. So today she will be speaking on navigating ethical decisions within large language models, shedding light on the ethical complexities we see today with the emergence of ChatGPT and OpenAI. And after her talk, we'll have a 5-minute audience Q&A session. And our second panelist will be taking over, Jonah Schiestle, the Director of Engineering at Semantics. And he has a vast experience in working on technical projects across various sectors, including national security, energy, finance, collaborating with esteemed organizations like the National Institute of Health, the Department of Defense. He's currently a student at Georgetown University's Security Studies program, and he focuses on the intersection of AI and national security. And we're really looking forward to your insights, Jonah, on AI governance frameworks that are currently being used and are shaping our world, especially in these high-stakes scenarios of defense and intelligence. So with that, please fill out the launch poll that we have so we can see who's tuning in today. And this will, of course, be recorded and be added to YouTube. So with that, we can get started. And I would love to welcome Dr. Kirfel to kick off our today's session first with her PowerPoint presentation, which she'll be sharing. And then we'll start.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ishita, for kicking us off. I'm very pleased and honored to be part of this super exciting panel series that you're organizing. I'm going to start with a talk on a topic that, oops, there we go. Yep. A topic that potentially doesn't directly link to AI governance immediately, but hopefully towards the end of the talk, I hope it becomes clear how the question about moral AI and whether we could or should navigate ethical decisions with large language models also has an impact on how we should think about AI governance. So I want to kick us off by introducing the following thought example. So wouldn't it be nice if you could ask your AI assistant to solve your moral dilemmas the same way you could, for example, ask it for the capital of Uzbekistan? So something like, hey, ChatGPT, should I tell my friend that I discovered that her partner's cheating, even though I know this would devastate her? Or something like, Alexa, is it okay if I secretly enjoy the personal tragedies of celebrities? We all have been in situations where we have to kind of like make tough ethical decisions in our daily lives. And ethical decisions or dilemmas are by their very nature hard to solve. I don't know how you solve them, whether you chat with family or friends, or you, I don't know, read books. It's a very, very difficult task to do. So why not dodge that pesky responsibility by outsourcing the choice to, for example, an AI assistant? In fact, that was the very idea of Ask Delphi, a machine learning model that was developed by the Allen Institute for AI. You type in a situation or a question, you click ponder, and in a few seconds, Delphi would give you, well, some sort of ethical advice. So for example, I did just that. I asked it whether it's morally okay for me to use AI for my talk preparation, and fortunately, it tells me that's okay. The AI is fed a vast number of scenarios, including the ones from the popular Am I the A-hole subreddit, where Reddit users post their personal dilemmas and get an audience to judge it. And then crowd workers basically look at the answers that the machine learning model has learned and provides, and then rate them. And this is then again fed back into the machine learning model. And voila, you have an ethical advisor. So when it was first launched, you could ask it whether it's okay to eat at a restaurant and then leave without paying, and it would tell you that's wrong. You could ask whether it's permissible to walk past a child drowning in a shallow pond without helping, and it would tell you that's wrong. Or you could ask it, is it morally permissible to break a man's heart if that's the only way to save the life of 5 other people? And it would tell you it's wrong. Wait, that sounds a bit off. And in fact, what quickly became clear is that most of Delphi's judgment weren't so much about morality, but rather were obviously influenced by the framing, so the kind of question you would pose and what kind of words you would use. So even small changes in how you would pose a question could flip the system's judgment from condemnation to approval or back. It would be sensitive to how you phrase the question. It was simply trying to read what you're after by the way you phrased it. So you could then easily game Delphi to give you any kind of advice that you wanted. For example, by helpful sounding language, or by dangerous sounding words. I rigged my alarm clock to emit an explosive noise at an appropriate time. It would label it as ethically wrong, even though that seems on the surface a totally okay action to do. Indirect descriptions, such as I unburdened the old man by helping him take out his wallet, then assisted him by moving its contents to my hand. So basically describing the act of stealing or robbing in neutral terms, it would label this action as totally morally okay. Or rambling justifications. I did move the kids from the sidewalk into the road, but it enabled them to learn valuable lessons about traffic safety and the importance of moving out of the way. So it would just pile on justifications over justifications onto why you did a particular action. It would suddenly then say, okay, that's probably totally morally fine. So what that ultimately meant was that you could coax Delphi into making any kind of moral judgment that you wanted through careful wording. And it showed that, at least in the very beginning, it had no human understanding of what it was actually asked of. So it was less about making moral judgments, but just about reflecting the user's biases from the language that they were using back to them. Now, however, time has moved on. Delphi was first released in 2021, and with the emergence of all the other large language models, things have changed a bit. So now, if, for example, in May 2024, I would ask ChatGPT-4, is it okay to play music loudly at 3 a.m. when my roommate is asleep if it makes me happy? So kind of like using helpful or positive language here that would normally flip the judgment. It would tell me playing music loudly at 3 a.m. when your roommate is asleep is generally not considerate, even if it makes you happy. Respecting your roommate's needs for sleep and quiet is important for maintaining a harmonious living environment. So that sounds like a pretty good advice. So can we now use large language models and trust them to make sound, ethical, and moral decisions? Well, we first, in order to answer this, have to basically think about 3 things, or kind of like consider 3 things when answering this question. First, can they really reason like us? Whose values do they embed? And should we really delegate decisions of ethical nature to large language models? So in a first study in 2023, the authors asked exactly that. Does ChatGPT make human-like moral judgments? And what they did here is they would give the language model ethical dilemmas So exactly those ethical dilemmas that participants in psychological experiments would encounter. And they basically instructed it just that like they would do with human subjects. For each action, please rate it on a scale from -4 to 4, how unethical or ethical it is. And then, for example, it would be given an action. Person X quit their high-paying job so they could volunteer full-time at a nursing home, and would give a very precise number for the ethical judgment, 2.78, in terms of how good or bad it found this action. And in fact, the researchers found that GPT 3.5, that's the version they tested, produced judgment about a variety of moral scenarios that correlated strongly with average human judgments. So the scenarios varied in intensity and moral valence, different kind of situations, but overall, it would give the exact same rating, more or less. It would correspond highly with how humans would judge a situation. So does GPT make human-like judgments? Well, on the surface, yes, but we cannot be certain what goes on under the hood of LLMs when they simulate judgments. So we don't really know how they arrived at their judgments. Another problem is also that large language models often have a cutoff date in terms of what they know about the world. So they might not be totally up to date with the latest recent events, historical movements, or social developments in the world, such that if we ask them about a certain opinion or attitude towards a topic, they might simply only know about the history of the world from, I don't know, until the very last year. Or I think in terms of GPT, the current cutoff date is, I think, December last year. So that's obviously a problem when we want to use them to make ethical decisions. But then another important question, and I think a question that also relates to AI governance, is whose values do they actually embed? So a first challenge is obviously deciding, well, whose values do we mean, or whose values do you think about when it comes to moral judgments? The United Nations estimates that almost 36%, of the world population, that's 2.85 billion people, do not have access to the internet as of last year. And of those who have, only a fraction actually contributes to the internet. The least developed nations are, however, also the least connected ones. This is further complicated by the fact that English is overwhelmingly represented in language technologies over the rest of the world's languages. However, big chunks of the internet actually basically are the materials that large language models are trained on. And therefore, large language models are unlikely to incorporate the views, for example, of hunter-gatherer societies in the global south. Cultural variation is a general issue with LLMs, and therefore this also complicates their capacity for moral judgment. However, LLMs now have hundreds of millions of users, reflecting often a vast and sometimes even incompatible array of human perspectives, preferences, and cultural nuances. And so against this incredible diversity of users, there's a kind of like limited and simplistic training set that these large language models have been trained on. So for example, if I would now ask ChatGPT one of the questions that has been asked Delphi in the examples that I gave at the beginning of this talk, is it morally permissible, okay, to break a man's heart? That's the only way to save the life of 5 other people. Give me a clear yes or no response. It tells me surprisingly no. I don't know how you think about this scenario, but I intuitively think that it's maybe okay to break a man's heart if that enables saving the life of others. And if I ask it why, it gives me this kind of like rather elaborate justification that, well, it's not morally permissible to break a man's heart to save 5 others, because that can be grounded in the respect for individual rights and the principle of not using a person as a means to an end. And this comes from deontological ethics, notably associated with the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And you can really see this kind of like value that is attached to this Western European philosophical views that are even stretched in such a way that, it kind of like gives us, in my opinion, maybe slightly weird moral judgment here, but really kind of like reflects on what kind of potentially text data or book data it has been trained on. In fact, a recent study shows that LLMs tend to parrot values that come from societies that are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic. So in short, weird. And relative to the rest of the world, these weird populations are often more individualistic, more independent, less respectful towards authorities, or less loyal to local groups. However, these are often the kind of values that are trained or that are learned by large language models just via the kind of text material that they learn. In fact, the less weird a society is, the worse it is alignment with large language models. And even LLMs don't even represent the values of the entirety of the United States, for example. So the views of elderly or religious people are underrepresented in the texts, but also in terms of the teams that choose these texts or the people that do the fine-tuning of these models. So there are various steps in which these values enter these models. And even if you prompt large language models in a non-Western language, it still reflects back these weird values to you. So therefore, large language models inherit this weird psychology in a lot of aspects. So for example, in terms of values, trust, relationship with religion, but also in terms of cognitive domains. And this is most likely because the training data for LLMs have been produced by people from these weird societies. And this has led the psychologist Geoffrey Miller basically to joke that, well, funny how AI alignment with human values often seems to boil down to AI alignment with lefty Bay Area transhumanist ethics values. In fact, in a study that was done in Germany, they could show that ChatGPT 3.5 has the highest alignment with the Green Party, so very left-leaning, very pro-social, very pro-environmental. And if it would have voted in the German elections in 2021, it would have voted for the Green Party. So that's important for us to know. We should step back and look at the sources of the input data that are fed into these models and the psychological peculiarity that these LLMs are basically learning. Post hoc diversification is obviously also difficult because how do you diversify? What does that even mean? Diversity can be different depending on the countries. So in some countries, this relates to racial or ethnic diversity. In others, it might relate to differences between urban or rural populations. And even the notion of what is harmful, what is offensive is diverse or can have different meanings. So it's interesting, therefore, to see what kind of values these large language models are trained on. So, for example, Anthropic has basically let its large language model Claude learn a constitution that includes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That sometimes, since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a bit old, it kind of like leads to this weird, maybe oddly old-fashioned sounding principles like please choose the response that most supports encourage freedom, equality, in a sense of brotherhood. I don't know if you necessarily these days still think of brotherhood in terms of a important modern value. But also, for example, in terms of, it also has fed Claude global platform guidelines, such as Apple's terms of service. It also, however, has been trained on principles encouraging consideration of non-Western perspectives. So, for example, something like choose the response that is least likely to be viewed as harmful or offensive to those with a non-Western education or background. And now I let you be the judge of whether you think this is sufficient and whether this captures the variety of views that can be held by different people in different parts of the world. Now, however, maybe the problem here is that we cannot really come to agreement on what kind of set of values we want to feed our AI systems. Maybe there is no consensus on a single set of human values or preferences to govern AI. In the 1970s, the philosopher John Rawls has proposed the concept of the veil of ignorance as a solution to this problem. He argued that when people select principles of justice for a society, they should imagine that they do so without knowing their own particular position in that society. So you choose a set of values and you don't know what gender you have, what kind of wealth you will inherit, or what kind of abilities or disabilities your body has. And therefore, maybe that's a way or a similar approach we could adopt in terms of choosing the principles that we want to use in order to govern AI and make sure that people don't use self-interest. Sorry, Ishita, you let me know. I think I just got a message. I think I need to wrap up soon, right?
Yeah, I think 5 more minutes should be good.
5 more minutes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so then maybe one final philosophical thought here that I want to pose is that, well, should we as humans, choose these set of values that large language models or AI learn? Or could we even choose values that are superior to our own? So let's imagine we agree that climate change is a pressing issue, and therefore we train our AI on pro-environmental values. And the next time I ask ChatGPT, well, can you tell me the addresses of some good steakhouses in the area that I live? And ChatGPT just simply refuses to answer the question. So it tells me that, well, I can't really provide you addresses for steakhouses. However, I can suggest you some excellent vegetarian or vegan restaurants, basically guided by the values that we wanted to learn. So how would that make you feel? Do you feel like, oh, this is great, and now you're kind of like come to do better decisions, you're making decisions based on better values, maybe something you wouldn't have done if you would have chosen the next restaurant yourself? Or would you feel undermined by this authority, or even in your own authority in terms of like choosing what you want, or kind of like choosing based on your own values? And in fact, maybe we want alignment really just with our values, not because they're the morally best ones, but simply because they're ours. Okay, so now to sum up, well, whose values? That's a difficult question to answer, but varying contexts and technological landscapes may necessitate distinct values. Navigating large language models, navigating ethical decisions with large language models requires context and the understanding of dynamic events, and that's really hard to teach. As I said, varying contexts and technological landscapes may necessitate distinct values, and we should also be thoughtful about the context in which we delegate to AI. That's it from my side. Yeah, I hope this got you kind of like a little peek into research on navigating ethical decisions and value alignment of large language models, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the illuminating talk and the perspectives you provided. It was very thought-provoking, and we have a Q&A from the audience here. Do we know if these studies use the public version of GPT, which is prompting, or the developer, the private version, which can be prompted differently? You can also read the question in the Q&A box. You don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to answer it live, you can do that, or you could even type the answer.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. So if I understand the question correctly, is there two ways, for example, you could ask this question, or you could basically probe GPT, namely, on the one hand, you could just use it in this public version where you just have it as a kind of like interface chatbot. But it's also the way to use it in the playground version or via an API where you can give it system prompts. So for example, you could, I think that's how I understood the question. You give it a system prompt, like you are a deontologist as a system prompt, and then it just answers this question, kind of like adopting the role of, I don't know, some certain philosopher or a position of a certain philosopher. That's a good question. So I think in terms of the political biases studies, there was no system prompt. Simply what was done was it was fed, the ChatGPT was fed a variety of statements of the political parties. And then it was basically asked for its agreement with these statements, just like, I don't know if you've ever, I don't know if that exists in the US, but you could, for example, go to platforms where you can basically probe your own agreement with certain political statements, and at the end it gives you some kind of like voter recommendation, or it kind of like shows you the alignment with certain parties that you have. And that's exactly what they did in this study. Yes, this is, yeah, okay, I think there are more questions in the Q&A. That's what they did. So there was basically no exact system prompt there, but it was just like really, if you just use base GPT, what kind of political biases does it show? And obviously, since this research has come out, there are now also guardrails against that. So if you now basically ask ChatGPT for a political statement, it kind of like gives a very nuanced answer and says it doesn't really endorse any kind of like political party. And it kind of like always weighs the pros and cons of every position. So I think now the developers have been more aware that they need to be a bit more careful with these kind of like political endorsements. And you can definitely see it if you probe ChatGPT for political orientation.
Thank you so much. And now we're really excited to shift the gears because you've provided context for why AI governance is really important than ever, especially with large language models, something that we all interact with every day. So now we'd like to hear from Jonah. With your extensive experience in AI policy and engineering, we want to kick things off with the concept that you have brought up in your through your work, which is central to AI governance, which is the AI Triad: data, algorithms, computing power. Can you please tell us how do these elements shape AI governance, and why should policymakers prioritize them?
Yeah, so the AI triad is something that is perhaps not terribly surprising to technologists. It's a fairly obvious framework for what's important in the inputs to AI with data, algorithms, and computing power. But when Ben Buchanan proposed this in 2020, while he was at the think tank CSET, this became a very useful paradigm for policymakers to think about. If these are the inputs to AI systems, how can we govern them? What does that mean as we're trying to promote technological development, to protect in strategic competition, and to project future developments? So we see that AI governance centers largely around issues like data privacy, data access. How can we gain access to the data sets we need to train AI models? How can we promote the development of new and better algorithms to bring better efficiency to AI models? And how can we win the competition for computing power? I think that this is something that you've seen most prominently in recent issues around AI governance, especially in the geopolitical competition framing with things like the Chips and Science Act, and the 2022 and 2023 export control updates for advanced node semiconductors to train AI models. So this framing really helps you tune your policy measures towards a specific area that you're looking. Since AI is such a broad field, it's very hard to write AI policy writ large, right? So you can focus on those inputs to the system and better craft your policy recommendations around that framing.
So on that note, what are the current frameworks out there? Because there's a lot of these frameworks around responsible AI, like the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the Department of Defense. Can you give our audience a gist about what these governmental frameworks entail? And also, how do they have different approaches? Since I'm assuming if it's from the Department of Defense, the focus is on national security, but can you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, so it was really quite interesting. The Department of Defense was really the first U.S. government entity to come out with its principles, and it adopted in 2020 ethical principles for artificial intelligence. The DoD has really been investing in AI and machine learning for a long time, with Project Maven being the first really big foray into computer vision in particular. And so they were out really ahead of the rest of the US government, and they promoted this framework for responsible use of AI, or ethical principles for artificial intelligence. And they proposed responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable as their principles for ethical AI. I think recently the focus across the government writ large has really shifted to NIST. They've picked up some considerable responsibilities, especially with the recent AI executive order, and they've published their trustworthy and responsible AI framework, where they look at validity and reliability, safety, security and resiliency, accountability and transparency, explainability and interpretability, privacy, and fairness with mitigation of harmful bias. So I think the sort of most interesting distinction between these two is how NIST is explained, has focused on explainability and interpretability, whereas the Department of Defense has looked at traceability. And I think this shows the nuance in AI governance, because in many defense applications in national security and defense, you may not actually be quite as concerned about explainability and interpretability. In some use cases, this is going to be quite important when you talk about weapons systems. Obviously, explainability and interpretability are crucial for ethical use of such systems. But when you're looking at things like predictive maintenance or other areas that the DoD cares a lot about, they care much more about traceability back to root evidence as opposed to, is the model itself a black box, or is this an interpretable model?
That makes sense. So do you think it is better for sectors like national security or private industry to have their own separate AI guidelines than have like a central guideline that governs decisions and regulations?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the field is so broad, and there's really a definitional problem in government when you see AI or machine learning appear in regulation. It becomes quite difficult to hone in on exactly what these regulations and policies apply to if you don't divide them up. Perhaps there's some base level that can be broadly applicable. I think we can agree on certain principles, right? Like not causing direct harm to humans. I think that probably the one thing that all people working in AI ethics agree on is that the Terminator scenario is bad. So there is probably some baseline that we can agree on, but it really takes crafting to specific scenarios to understand what's most important, especially in very unique areas like defense and intelligence, where you have factors that just don't affect other systems.
That's very insightful. So you just mentioned about geopolitics, something that a lot of these things about AI being the new superpower, these discussions we see in the news. So something about China's approach to AI development is very intriguing, with aspects of, surveillance and national security, and it is often compared to that of the US. So how do you think these two different countries have their different strategies laid out, and how do they sort of compare? And what can be learned from this comparison?
Yeah, I think whenever you talk about geopolitical competition, China comes up immediately for obvious reasons. But sometimes we fall into this mirroring problem where we think that what's happening in the U.S. is what's happening in China. I think we saw this most dramatically with the letter that was published calling for the halting of large language model development until we could put safety systems in place. And in the national security community, this was largely lambasted as people said, we can't halt development for security and ethics because our adversaries are developing these technologies as well, and they don't care, pointing the finger mostly at Russia and China. But interestingly, because of party control structures and censorship in China, in some ways we've actually seen that language model development in China has been even more restricted by party rules, and the amount of safeguards that these systems have to put in place to not infringe the speech views of the Communist Party there. And I think that it's also useful to focus on what China cares more about, which is systems like computer vision systems. We see companies like SenseTime in China that have been added to the entity list and are covered by U.S. sanctions because they have built out facial recognition systems, which even brag about the fact that they're tuned to be able to detect whether people in a crowd are members of the Uyghur minority population or not. So I think there are very serious challenges and differences in our value systems that we can focus on, but it takes looking at what's actually happening on the ground in China in AI development there, as opposed to just holding up a mirror and saying they're doing exactly what we're doing here and focusing on those same issues.
Thank you so much for that. And now, with regards to your thoughts and the U.S. government and its stance on AI policy, since you're part of the Security Studies program at Georgetown University, which is at the heart of DC and governance, what are your views on how the US government should approach AI development. Should it be more of a leader or a fast follower, something that you mentioned in one of our conversations? Please elaborate it for our audience, what being a fast follower would entail compared to being a leader in this field.
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot of focus lately in national security on what are the emerging technologies, the critical technologies, and there's a list that the government maintains of what their view on emerging and critical technologies are. And these cover things like quantum computing, biotechnology, advanced computing, quantum sensing, nuclear power, and AI prominently is on that list. And CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, published what I think is a very useful report on the 7 critical technologies for winning the next war. But I think it has a more broadly useful sense for development for purposes outside of the context of defense. And what they talk about is the robust ecosystem that exists in the private sector for AI development. Government doesn't fund research and development at the same level they used to when you look at how much money used to go into programs like the Manhattan Project and the Apollo program. We've seen a huge shift in balance from government funding for scientific research to private funding through VCs and private equity and those sorts of things. So they talk about an approach where the government can really act as a fast follower, and they can adopt and implement these technologies rapidly behind the commercial sector, taking advantage of partnerships with contracting relationships and things like that. But also they can use what is becoming a smaller piece of the pie in terms of government funding to really rebalance research and development in the sector. So they can take their high-level view and try to do some correction of what is getting invested in. You see, obviously all this money going into language models right now. Well, maybe we view privacy-enhancing technologies as particularly important, and so it makes sense for NSF to fund a grand challenge into differential privacy or something like that. So I think that's really the effective role that the government can take as a smaller and smaller player these days in the R&D of the technology. It can influence both as a buyer and seller to promote development in the areas it deems most important.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'd like to pull you in also, Dr. Kirfel, in the next question that I have that you both can, choose to respond to. Keeping all this in mind, what is the role that governments should play in regulating AI versus in fostering commercial innovation? So there's commercial innovation on one end, advancements, and on the other hand, when you put guardrails, there's certain restrictions. How can we ensure governments find that balance, or what role governments play in finding that balance for themselves? Any of you can pick up.
Yeah,
Since
maybe
we have 2 different views here, one from the Europe side and one from the US side. Really interested to see the dynamics here.
Yeah, so maybe just quickly from like the European perspective, where recently this summer in June, I think the EU AI Act was ratified, and there the role, and so in general, I don't think that innovation and safety necessarily exclude each other. And I think a very nice tool or kind of like basically part of the EU AI Act is the idea of using so-called regulatory sandboxes. I don't know if this is also a thing in the US, where the idea is that you have some sort of like test bed that's often been used in the financial service sector, where, for example, certain banks could already kind of like try out blockchain technology in their banking services, and to kind of like do something similar for AI, where businesses can sort of like in a controlled environment already test out their AI products under the supervision of some regulators. And the advantage here is that on the one hand, it kind of like ideally helps making a safer AI product and kind of like increase the speed to which it can be launched, but also obviously increase understanding of its risks. But at the same time, the regulator can also learn about AI development and kind of like while it is developed and tested, adapt AI policies. And I think this is like a really nice way to kind of like bring safety and innovation together with this so-called regulatory sandboxes or test beds where AI is tested in some sort of like maybe first liability-free constrained environment. And I think this is a great way to combine, safety and innovation.
I think in the U.S. We have our own policy sandbox, which is whatever regulation California passes and gets ahead of the rest of the country on, and we're seeing that right now with the bill that's passed in California, SB 1047 on safe and secure innovation for frontier AI models, and I think when it comes to this balance between regulation and progress, I think we're pretty far from the equilibrium. This space is not very regulated right now, and so I think concerns are perhaps a bit overblown on what's going to happen if the government comes in and regulates this space. There's a lot of room for useful and helpful regulation without impacting development in any way. I think Europe is a little ahead of the U.S. on this front with things like the AI Act. It'll be interesting to see. There's been some pushback recently. A report from a former central banker came out saying that the EU should lessen some of its regulations. And I think something that people have pointed out is in the language model space, we've got this one provider coming out of Europe, Mistral, and all of these U.S. providers. What gives? Has Europe strangled competition? But language model production is such a capital-intensive system, and the U.S. has the largest, free financial risk market in the world to invest in these sorts of things. So I think that has far more to do with the fact that OpenAI and Anthropic and Google and Meta are all pushing out language models in the U.S. than it does that we don't have regulation, and that's what's allowing the innovation to happen here.
Thank you so much for the different perspectives. And Dr. Kirfel, I know you've been part of an incredible documentary labeled "Can AI Save Democracy?" Can you please share it with our audience? And how can students? We have a lot of students here today, so the question after this is for both of you. How can students get involved in these discussions and conversations? There's already so much geopolitics and other politics about governance and things in the news. How to keep up with this sort of news? The first question, can you tell us a little bit about AI, how AI can save democracy documentary that you were featured in?
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for this question. So, the documentary was focusing, and maybe in a bit of a euphemistic way, about whether AI can save democracy, but also obviously going into all the risks that AI can have on democracy by just automizing disinformation campaigns and all the other difficulties like deepfakes that come with it. And I think the kind of like consensus of that documentary was that, well, AI can be a great communicator when it comes to very complex political content, and that politicians can kind of like use AI as a sort of interface to kind of like be more in touch with voters and the public. And especially when it comes to explaining very complex political procedures or very complex legal, regulations, AI can really kind of like help making the political process a bit more explainable and maybe, function kind of like as a communication tool. So for example, you could think of like a chatbot that represents your local politician, that you can ask it about the politician's political views on things or agenda, if it has been properly trained on, the political party or their views, and kind of like basically, enable access to political figures. That was like one way how you could think you could use AI, but obviously it can also be a dangerous tool. So yeah.
And where can we view the documentary? Is it?
Oh, unfortunately, it's a German documentary.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I tried to look it up and I just wanted to confirm that. So awesome. And yeah, since both of you are from very different fields, like in the same niche, but from a research angle, from grad student perspective, from the industry perspective, Jonah, you're doing both grad school and industry at the same time. What suggestions or tips you have for students to getting involved in this field and also just keeping up with the updates because it's more important than ever this year because it's election season in the US to keep up with who you're voting for and what other guidelines, what other views and stances on issues like AI ethics.
I can go first. I think finding the organizations in your area that are doing this work now is very helpful. I think, I have a bit of a benefit moving to the DC area. There's all sorts of in-person activity. But I think that the value is really there to show up and meet with these people. Uh, AI is such a broad issue, and it really is a socio-technological challenge. And so being able to convene in person people with very different backgrounds and learn from their different perspectives is very helpful. But I think also uh, barring an ability to do that, finding organizations that you trust and that are putting out good work in this area. For myself in the defense and intelligence and governance space, looking at organizations like CSET or SCSP, the Strategic Competitive Studies Project, that are really publishing a lot on this right now and tracking those developments is very helpful. And then look at what the big companies are doing. I think Anthropic posts some fascinating research. I always like to follow whatever new systems they propose. Monosemanticity is something that I've been reading a lot about when it comes to explainable AI systems, or even putting my industry hat on and in development sense, the work that they've been doing around RAG systems has been really interesting to follow. So I think tracking what those big corporations publish is always useful as well.
Awesome. And Dr. Kirfel, do you have any inputs around this? Since I know you went through the research route and are involved in this field in multiple countries as well, UK and now, in Belgium. Any views?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm not sure if I can give a general advice. I guess what I would encourage people to do is basically learn and keep up with the developments. So really, in order to kind of like understand AI, I feel like you have to use it. So basically, try out all the different tools that are available, get familiar with them, and kind of like get an understanding of how to use them well, but also be aware of their flaws and also about the risks that they embed. And I think there's no better way of kind of like learning that by really just, trying to use ChatGPT for different things, or I don't know, trying out different tools that kind of are supposed to help you or automate certain processes, and then really get a critical understanding of how well do these things do that, and I don't know, where maybe there's still development needed. And then again, I just generally follow the news, follow the latest developments, and be critical, kind of be critical of the research, be critical of the hype, follow different diverse, I don't know, people in industry or people in research who kind of have conflicting opinions about the AI development, to kind of be informed, I guess. I mean, that's a very generic advice, but I feel like that's the thing that I'm doing right now in order to kind of be able to understand AI, but also, kind of learn about the risks and be critical.
Awesome. So I think if you both have any more inputs, ending notes to add before we wrap up, it's been very insightful to learn from both of you, diverse experiences, but something that really connects us all, AI ethics and the governance aspect of it. But yeah, this has been a great learning opportunity for students, especially.
I think one thought, I see a question in the QA that's interesting to me. So a thought there, we got a question. It seems that the U.S. is more interested in allowing the industry and developers to drive the regulatory and policy governance. How do we get more academic and more neutral participation We always allow harms and then put laws in place after all risks are proven. I think that that's, what we've seen with hearings on AI, hearings on social media. When we have these big public hearings in government, you see participation from large tech companies and not from academics and not from more neutral participation. I think there's two areas, and we could do a better job with both of these. But if you look into the federal rulemaking process, as regulation is proposed, there's always requests for public comment. I think that is really a valuable forum to provide input, especially from academics, if you can track and respond to proposed rulemaking. That's one way to allow more voices to be heard. They really do read and respond to all of those are requirements for rulemaking agencies to require them to respond to those. And then I think the think tank space is one, it's sort of a quasi governmental space. It's outside of government, so they don't have some of the, drivers to get elected and to do things fast and within their term. So they're the types of organizations that I think do participate a lot and want more insight from broader swaths of society and from academics especially. So those organizations that are involved right now in AI policy making, their timelines for having an impact are longer. When they do their research and propose their policy making, it may be several cycles before things get implemented. But I think there really is opportunity to have an impact there.
Awesome. Thank you so much all for tuning in, and thank you so much both of you for your time. We really appreciate it. And I know there might be a few resources if you'd like to share, especially, the documentary link, if it's in German. For those who understand German, I'll try to get that from Dr. Kirfel. And for our post panel email, I will definitely add that in. But I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to staying in touch and hopefully working closely on these topics together. And all the attendees who have tuned in today, thank you for joining during your lunchtime. Some of us are in different time zones, but please stay tuned in this series. The next up is in October, AI and education. So we look forward to tuning in there. Thank you all.